Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Prison Guard's Daughter, My Journey Through the Ashes of Attica, by Deanne Quinn Miller with Gary Craig. Narrated by Rosemary Benson. Forward. One of nature's gifts is the bond that often forms between a little girl and her father. For 5-year-old Deanne Quinn, that gift shattered when inmates rioting at New York State's Attica prison killed a respected and well-liked corrections officer, Bill Quinn. The trauma of his loss fragmented her memory of him. Her mother, trying to deal with her own grief and protect Dee and her 2 sisters, suppressed information about him. The state, trying to protect itself, suppressed more information. Yet, spiritually, Dee's bond with her father never left her as she sought to learn all she could about him, and in the process, about herself. The outline of the 1971 Attica riot that destroyed Dee's happy home is fairly well known. The inmates' grievances, their brutal takeover of much of the prison, the days of negotiations through outside observers, the order of then-Governor Nelson Rockefeller for state police to storm the prison, the bloodbath when many members of the assault force attacked with their guns, killing 29 inmates and 10 hostages among the 128 men they shot, and the brutality that state troopers and corrections officers inflicted on hundreds of inmates who had surrendered. Still in need of a proper telling is the account that Dee now gives us of the state's abysmal treatment of the surviving hostages and their families, and their struggle for redress 3 decades later. From girlhood onward, Dee sought truth. In midlife, she would seek justice. The former effort was not mere curiosity. Beset by inner conflicts and immersed in widely believed misinformation, she drove herself to learn all she could about her father, the way he died, the Attica riot, and the men behind the riot. Her search led her improbably to befriend, among others, inmate leaders Richard X. Clark and Frank Big Black Smith, as well as riot observers New York Assemblyman Arthur O. Eve and noted New York Times journalist Tom Wicker. As she writes, "My Attica journey was taking me places I never imagined. I will learn all I can and speak with whomever I can, and my father will one day be whole for me." Dee's quest for justice was the 3rd such quest that followed the riot. First, a special prosecutor's office, which I joined, sought to hold accountable the inmates and law officers who had committed violent crimes during and after the riot. That effort was designed to look serious, yet to fail, moving me to resign in protest. The second quest was a lawsuit by which hundreds of inmates and their next of kin sought civil damages for being wrongfully shot and tortured. In 2000, the state agreed to pay them $8 million and their attorneys $4 million. That $8 million was paltry by prevailing personal injury standards, but according to the inmates' lead counsel, Elizabeth M. Liz Fink, the largest settlement in the history of prison litigation. The inmates' settlement provoked the 3rd quest for justice, that of the hostages and their families whom the state had sacrificed. In the months and years before the riot, top state officials had kept the prison increasingly more dangerous than necessary. They recaptured the prison in a way that could not have saved the hostages if the inmates had been bent on killing them. Their police shot 10 hostages dead and wounded several more. They then swindled survivors and bereaved families out of fair recompense for what they had put them through, and thwarted every effort to undo the swindle, leaving widows to raise children in poverty. And they have yet to apologize for anything. The inmates' settlement angered the hostages and their families. They started the riot and got all that money, and brought them together as the Forgotten Victims of Attica, with Dee gradually emerging as their leader. The destitute little girl of 1971 became the astute, energetic, and determined woman who, with former hostage Mike Smith, attorney Gary Horton, and many others, sought justice, even though by now they did not have a legal leg to stand on. 4 years later, the state agreed to pay them the same $12 million as the inmate settlement. Miracles like New York giving up millions it wasn't legally required to pay don't happen by themselves. Here, Dee relates the fascinating story of how she and the others brought it on. Disclosure: I met Dee shortly after the Forgotten Victims formed themselves, and was glad to find her large-minded enough to understand why I had once felt obligated to write an affidavit on behalf of the man convicted of killing her father. She invited me to participate in the Forgotten Victims campaign, as she relates herein, which I was happy to do given the rightness of their cause. As their co-counsel Jonathan Grades aptly told them, "You were screwed." For many years now, my wife Nancy and I have thought of Dee and her husband David as dear friends whom we see too seldom. We, the public, depend for our safety on 3 groups of risk-takers: firefighters, who with rare exceptions are unalloyed heroes; police, who are mostly decent people in my experience, but include too many bad apples thanks to too much impunity; and corrections officers, who are mostly out of sight and too often portrayed in fiction and films as nonentities or brutes. But this book immerses us in the actual lives of a group of corrections officers and other prison employees, their wives, their parents, and their children, as they seek recognition and justice for what they endured and sacrificed for the state of New York, and, by extension, for you and me. I hope that Dee's book goes far toward improving people's perception of these men and women who devote and sometimes lose their lives to serve us. Of all that I have read about Attica, this book is the most uplifting. Dee shows us in full candor the woman who arose from her childhood tragedy to accomplish the near impossible. There are few happy endings to the stories of Attica. This book has one of them. If Bill Quinn had survived, he would surely be proud of what Dee accomplished. I believe that in whatever hereafter awaits us, he is very proud of her. Malcolm Bell, former state prosecutor in the Attica Uprising investigation, Randolph Center, Vermont. Prologue. Late 2000. Never had I imagined sitting in a Harlem restaurant, one of the few white patrons here, waiting to meet one of the alleged ringleaders of the violent uprising that forever changed the course of my life. Above the restaurant is a Muslim school for youth. I can hear the students reciting their lessons. This is a far cry from the largely white community in western New York where I grew up and still live. I have been to New York City before, numerous times, but then as a sightseer or as a high schooler considering the city for college. Now, at 35, I'm not here as a tourist, anything but. In normal circumstances, I would be interested in the food here. Other diners appear to be enjoying their morning meals, but I am battling a terribly disturbed stomach, a migraine that I'm sure would fell most people, and nerves that I cannot settle. I am waiting for Richard X. Clark to come through the restaurant door. Known for his radical Muslim politics in the early 1970s, Richard Clark was an inmate at the Attica Correctional Facility in September 1971, when the nation's deadliest prison riot exploded. My father died in that riot, beaten to death by prisoners like Clark. At least, that's how I once would have considered Richard Clark, a prisoner just like all the others at the maximum security prison where my father had worked. In the years after I lost my father, I was then a 5-year-old first grader, I did not distinguish between the prisoners. They were all faceless monsters to me, all of them responsible for ripping my family apart. My family would never be the same after the Attica riot, nor would I. I was not alone in this attitude toward the prisoners. My relatives harbored the same animosity, as did many in my neighborhood. We lived in the community that would be largely connected with the shouts of "Attica! Attica!" from Al Pacino in Dog Day Afternoon. Yes, Pacino's Hollywood-crafted focus was the prison and the riot's connections to the leftist politics of the 1960s and 70s, but to those who lived there, he might as well have been talking about us directly. The Attica community where I lived as a child, before we moved in an unsuccessful attempt to escape the memories of what we'd endured and suffered there, would become synonymous with American racism and bigotry. As an adult, I knew this was a simplistic and unfair portrayal. Many corrections officers, my dad among them, had treated inmates with respect before the riot ignited. But that was a more complicated narrative than the black-and-white story told by many in the media and popular culture. I had personally learned how the simple narrative was often wrong, an empty vessel for the storyteller to shape with his or her own preconceptions. I knew because I had relied on the narrative that the Attica riot, the initial chaotic uprising that killed my father, and the violent retaking by police days later, in which 39 people were fatally shot, was the fault of inmates, and inmates alone. By late 2000, I had learned better. And here I was, to meet Richard Clark, the man once considered a ringleader of the riot, and the man once charged with several dozen criminal counts of kidnapping for the hostage-taking during the rebellion. As I had discovered in the months before my visit to Harlem, Clark was only a ringleader in the sense that he'd gathered up other Muslim prisoners for a security detail that ensured the prison employees taken hostage by inmates were kept safe. He was a peacekeeper, not a riot instigator. I'd also learned that he'd tried to save my father's life. Throughout my childhood and after, I was told little about my father. I had tried for years to piece together who he was, and I often ran into roadblocks, even within my own family. What I did know was that Corrections Officer William Quinn was inextricably and forever linked with the Attica riot. He was the riot's first casualty, and the only man who died at the hands of prisoners. I could not fully learn of my father if I did not truly learn of the riot. By the time I sat down in the Harlem restaurant, waiting for the arrival of Clark, I had pushed aside my long-held beliefs about who was to blame for the prisoner revolt at Attica, and I had learned a great deal about my father, though there was still much to understand. I had decided that men like Clark could help me, and now he has agreed to meet with me and tell me just what he'd done on September 9th, 1971, in what was his unsuccessful attempt to save my bloodied and beaten father. For many, Attica is a lesson in a history book, or it's a television documentary about politics or prison reform, or a fictionalized and sensationalized film. For me, it is far more personal than that. It is the story of my father, of my family, and of me. I cannot separate my identity from the Attica riot, though often in life I have wanted to do just that. But long before this morning, as I wait for Richard Clark to stroll into the restaurant, I had made up my mind. I will learn all I can, and speak with whomever I can, and my father will one day be whole for me. Richard Clark is one piece of the puzzle, an important piece, and I am here to listen. Chapter 1. The Prison Whistle. Growing up in the town of Attica, you got used to hearing the prison whistle. Outsiders might have found the sound alarming, an omen of impending troubles. We knew better. As children of corrections officers, when we heard that whistle, even if miles away, we knew it simply meant that an inmate had walked off the prison farm, an actual farm located on prison grounds just beyond the high school, where inmates helped raise beef and dairy for prison use. Only inmates who demonstrated good behavior could work on the farm. Our families weren't wary or scared of those prisoners, even when they did try to escape their state-sanctioned punishment. Truthfully, most families in the area thought little to nothing of it. We were accustomed to the farm and the prisoners there. Residents would hear the whistle and assume the inmate would quickly be found. Even if there were a manhunt, and sometimes there was, the families weren't concerned. As kids, riding in the back seat of our family station wagon, I remember driving by the farm and seeing corrections officers in their uniforms supervising the inmates clad in green. The Attica Correctional Facility was part of our life, woven into the daily fabric for us. A prisoner could walk away from prison, and the nearby residents usually assumed he'd follow the train tracks into Buffalo or Rochester, and that he had no plans to hide out in our town. Attica is a small rural town in western New York, about 35 miles east of Buffalo, and the prison was one of its essential job providers. The prison, Westinghouse, the lumber mill, the box factory, the dog food factory, Acme, and a few stores. They were the residents' main sources of employment. It was a tight-knit town where everybody knew everybody. Many were related. I grew up at 11 Windsor Street, built at the turn of the 20th century, with maybe a dozen other houses on the street. Corrections officers lived in half of them, and their families and ours all played together and walked to school each day. It was a typical small-town childhood, playing on swings, games of Red Rover, What Time Is It, Mr. Fox? We had a playful black Labrador, Charlie. He and my dad were inseparable. There was a tranquil reassurance to our routine. We had our cute little house, and as children we darted up and down the street most days. We lived without a care or fear as our relatives entered the maximum security prison. It was not unusual for older siblings to be working at the prison, along with uncles and cousins. My grandfather worked at the prison as a civilian meat cutter, and my dad, Bill Quinn, was a corrections officer there. My uncle, my father's brother-in-law, oversaw the prison arsenal, where the firearms for corrections officers were stored. When my mom and dad first married, Dad worked as an attendant at the West Seneca Developmental Center, a facility that oversaw the care of institutionalized people with a range of disabilities. He grew close to the residents, one in particular, raising money from staff for a wig for a teenage girl who suffered from alopecia. She was so fond of my dad that he once took my mother to meet her. She tipped her wig at Mom, as if tipping a hat. My father left that job after a young boy died in his arms after a seizure. That was too much for him. He told my mother he could not return. It was just too painful. He then went to National Fuel Gas, working as a pipe-fitting apprentice, which he enjoyed. That job kept him in Batavia, close to home. While there, he passed the corrections officer exam and accepted a job in the corrections system, first working at the Greenhaven Prison near Poughkeepsie, New York, before being transferred to Attica Prison. Built in 1931, for a cost of $9 million, more than $150 million in present-day costs. The Attica prison was then considered a model institution, designed to relieve overcrowding and to be escape-proof. By itself, Attica's mile-and-a-quarter stone wall that enclosed the 55 acres of prison grounds amounted to 15% of the prison's total cost. Though in the thick of the Depression, New York state lawmakers believed the prison to be direly needed, regardless of expense. The cramped conditions at prisons across the state, from Sing Sing north of New York City to the Auburn prison west of Syracuse, had fueled an increasing number of riots. Within 2 years' time, 5 riots broke out in New York prisons. In July 1929, nearly 1,600 inmates at the Clinton prison, near the Canadian border, rioted. Police quickly regained control of the prison, killing 3 inmates. At the Auburn prison in the same year, a prisoner tossed acid onto an officer's face and stole the keys to the prison arsenal. A firefight ensued between inmates and police, with an assistant warden fatally shot. With more spacious room for housing inmates, Attica was expected to be the future of corrections, billed by the New York Times as a paradise, more likely than other institutions to rehabilitate prisoners. Much of what was proposed, better dining options, more comfortable bedding, more recreation alternatives, never completely materialized, however. By the time of my childhood, Attica was instead known as the home for some of the state's most dangerous criminals, from street gang killers to mafia murderers. The notorious bank robber Willie Sutton, who infamously said he robbed banks simply because that's where the money is, spent years in the prison and was released when I was 4 years old. Later, the prison would house serial killer David, son of Sam Berkowitz, and Mark David Chapman, who silenced John Lennon when he murdered him outside Lennon's Manhattan apartment. With its Gothic appearance, its arched entrances, and its gun towers along 30-foot-high walls, the prison may have appeared ominous to outsiders, an intimidating fortress. For many of those who lived in the town, it was simply part of the landscape. Generations of corrections officers lived in Attica. Of course, the terminology when I was a child and my father worked there was prison guard. In decades since, the term guard, though still common in popular parlance, gave way to corrections officer. This change represented changes within the system, as the officers sought to tell the world that they, too, were law enforcement, just like the police, and that they did more than simply keep tight watch over prisoners. Instead, their actions toward and treatment of inmates could help with rehabilitation. That would come later. What was to happen at Attica when I was a child, on September 9, 1971, would forever alter the image of prisons and what they should and should not be. I was in Mrs. Lane's first-grade class that day when we again heard the familiar prison whistle. What came next was unusual. The prison whistle was joined by the siren from the Attica Volunteer Fire Department, a different sound altogether, and though only 5 years old, I could distinguish between the two. My father was also president of the Volunteer Fire Department, and I knew when that siren sounded and he was home, he was about to dash out the door. As we paused and listened in the classroom, neither whistle stopped. They continued blaring. I could not remember a time when the whistles had not stopped. Our classroom learning came to a halt. The teachers were clearly concerned. They met in the hall, talking about whatever was going on. Typically, the classroom doors were closed during the school day as classes were underway. But this was different. The doors were left open to the hallway, and the whistles kept sounding. Teachers even shut the lights off in the classes, hoping to settle the students, who were beginning to chatter about the strangeness of the moment. There were many connections between the prison and our school. A number of the teachers were married to corrections officers. Mrs. Kretz and Mrs. Fargo, for example, both had husbands working at the prison. I'm sure those women were among the teachers gathered in the hall, wondering what was happening at the prison. Later in life, I would learn how childhood trauma affects memory, sometimes creating a brick wall that blocks many recollections, other times a sieve that allows some to filter through without rhyme or reason as to which survive and which vanish. There are still long spans of my childhood that I cannot unearth from my memory. Sometimes a partial memory is prompted by a photograph or an anecdote from a family member, but many are gone completely. Now, even 50 years later, I still see that day in fragments. At some point during the school day, I don't remember when, the principal came to our classroom door, and I was taken from class and led to the main office. Mrs. Witkowski, Loie, as my mother affectionately called her, was there. The Witkowskis lived 2 houses down from us, with 3 boys. Her husband, Tommy, was a corrections officer as well. I remember thinking, "Mrs. Witkowski, why are you here?" As the years have passed, I have combined my spotty memories with the few details my family and others shared with me. My mother was at home with my little sister Christine, who was 3 years old. My mother received a call from the prison, from someone unknown, telling her that her husband had been injured and was on his way by ambulance to a hospital in nearby Batavia. She then phoned a family friend who took her and my grandmother Quinn, my father's mother, to the hospital. My family had no concept of the magnitude of my father's injuries, or of what was happening at the prison. At school, Mrs. Witkowski told me that she would take me and my sister to Grandma and Grandpa's house in Darien. These were my grandparents on my mother's side. I remember riding in the back seat of Mrs. Witkowski's car. I was sad about leaving school. I had no understanding what was going on. Darien is only 5 miles away from Attica, so I'm sure the drive was quick. We were met by my grandmother, Grandma Willard, at the car, and I remember my grandmother saying something to the effect of, "Your dad's been hurt at work. That's why your mom's not here. That's why you'll be staying here with us." It wasn't much longer when my Uncle Jerry got off the school bus. He is my uncle, but we're only 4 years apart, raised more like siblings. He recalls being surprised that we were at his house before he was out of school. I always loved being at Grandma's house. She was a major influence on me as a child, and later as an adult. She was a hairdresser by trade, and had the most giving heart, and she lived for community service. She loved church hymns and enjoyed reaching for the highest notes. Whenever we were at her house, there was constant baking, and she always had craft projects for us: egg carton necklaces, sachets, ornaments made from pine cones. Grandma had a pretty room, as she called it, which was my mother's old room as a child. It was all lace curtains and a yellow floral comforter with a small chest of drawers that was full of knickknacks and items we could use for craft making. Although I didn't really grasp why I was at Grandma's, I was happy to be staying overnight. As I grew older, I slept in that pretty room plenty of times, always enjoying a sleepover with Grandma. There are other memories from those days. Very few, yet some are vivid. My grandmother's home was very busy, as I recall, but the memory that is most entrenched is the police surveillance that was there and stayed for days. My Uncle Jerry remembers workmen on a pole between my grandparents' home and the next-door neighbor. My grandfather told him they were actually police officers keeping an eye on the house. At times, there were as many as...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?